Welcome back to the second episode of Pen to Pod. In this episode, I sat down with T.N. Vitus, the author of Sacrilege and the first book of the Crown Killer saga, Heirs of Destruction. I have read both books by T.N. Vitus and I am obsessed with them. We talk mostly about her new debut, Heirs of Destruction, and if you are someone who is longing for a fantasy series that feels like Game of Thrones with complex characters and amazing world building, I highly recommend reading Heirs of Destruction. T.N. Vitus is an award-winning author specializing in the macabre and sacrilegious. They love writing anything under the fantasy umbrella, so long as there is rhythmic prose and complex characters. When not writing, which is rare, she is a voracious reader and consumer of media. If asked, they will gladly info dump about Lord of the Rings or whichever fantasy they are currently fixated on. She lives in Florida with her loving husband. You can find Sacrilege and Heirs of Destruction on sale now, and I highly recommend checking them out. This conversation was so much fun to have. We really dove deep into the world of Heirs. We talked a lot about world building and the title of this episode, which is the domino effect that world building has when you are writing such a complex high fantasy. I asked about the political system, the complex characters, the romantic and familial relationships that T.N. Vitus wrote about expertly in this book. She gave a really lovely insight into what the writing process for this book was like, gave a lot of great advice for any aspiring indie authors, and was very vulnerable about her experience as an indie author as well. This book was such a pleasure to read. I'm absolutely obsessed with one of the main characters, Azriel, but we follow three main characters, Azriel, Rayella, and Virgil, on this epic journey of mass proportion as they come into their new titles and their roles in this world. And as T.N. Vitus talks about in this interview, even though they are making all these great and crazy decisions, everything they do is temporary and just a small piece of the history of their land. So before I wax and wane too much about this book, let's jump into my conversation with T.N. Vitus. Thank you for coming on to the podcast. I'm super excited to talk to you. I like to ask this question, like I think most interviews start out this way, of just kind of taking us back to the beginning. So, when did you first know you wanted to write, or have you always identified as a writer?
So I really love this question because as corny as it sounds, like pretty much always, I don't know if this is a thing in most elementary schools or public school in general, but from like even first grade on, all of my classes had some kind of fiction writing aspect to them. Like every single grade, I had to do some kind of fiction writing. And like obviously when you're in first grade, it's going to be a very basic constructing sentences type of thing. But like every single year we had that. And then I think when I started third or fourth grade, we had a formalized writing class after school. So I would stay after school for the last like 2-3 years of elementary, and I would like learn about writing, about fiction writing, and we would do a bound manuscript at the end of that class. I know I have them somewhere, but I'm not sure where. I would usually do like short, like not poems, but like kind of prose type of things. Other people would do full-on short stories, and I would read those and get really inspired. And then in middle school, not really as much, but high school, I started working on more like ideas for novels. I didn't actually start finishing novels until I wrote Sacrilege. So it was a lot of just constructing from the ground up. And then eventually I got the opportunity or the idea, I guess, to write a full-fledged novel. But the amount of effort that my elementary experience gave me, I did put that towards writing other novels. Like the amount of effort that I've put into Heirs of Destruction, I did do that for another book in high school that I never finished. But it was still like I knew how to outline, I knew how to build character, I knew how to do all those things because of those classes that I had in elementary. So like even have a book that or I wrote in like first grade. So I would say that it's always been part of me.
That is amazing. I don't think I've ever heard of an elementary school curriculum having that aspect. I feel like I remember as a class, we were making a story together. I remember making a story about a zoo and I took that home. But that's really awesome that you're able to actually learn how to construct a story at such a young age. Were you a big reader then at that time as well?
Oh yeah. I know I don't really know how they measure this, and I don't know if they still do this now, but like I mean reading above grade level, that sort of thing. I read all through my grade levels and then was reading like, technically college level by the time I was like third or fourth grade. So I was reading full books by then. And I would just read whatever I wanted. I would get in trouble during class because I would have my book like under my desk reading. So yeah, always, always, always.
I did that too. I remember when I was reading the City of Bones series in grade school, high school, and I could not stop. And I just had it underneath my desk all the time.
That
Is
is a book. That is a book.
It is a book for
Mhm.
sure. Do you have any go-to genres then of books that you gravitate towards either then when you were reading or now as you read?
I mean, probably fantasy, but that's such a big genre. We have a lot more subcategories now. I feel like when I was younger, I mean, there's the typical like age-appropriate fantasies that people read. Oh my God, what are they called? Like The Magic Tree House, and then like aging
Yeah.
up into like full novels. I can't even really remember a lot of the ones that I read. Mostly fantasy. I prefer female protagonists, and I usually prefer them going from like a normal life to an extraordinary life. I wish I could give some titles, but I really don't remember. But like one book that always stuck with me, and I don't remember the name of it. It's a girl that finds out that she's a fairy, but they're like plant fairies. So she has like, it's a
Hmm.
little like body horror-ish. I think she has like grass or like some kind of plant stem that starts growing out, and it's like her wings. And then she goes and she meets a boy who's also part of that. And of course, it's a whole
Of
ordeal.
course. It's really true too that we do, I feel like, have more subgenres now when
Hmm.
reading than we did when we were younger. Like I feel like there was only like five authors that everyone read in like middle school, elementary school, high school, and that was it. And now there's just like way more life to
Oh
the
yeah.
fantasy genre, but every genre really.
I agree. I also did really like, I would technically say that this falls under fantasy in a way, but I love paranormal romance. I've always loved paranormal romance. So that was also a go-to. I feel like we are not getting as much traditionally published paranormal romance, which is why indie is so great.
Yeah, that's true too. The traditional publishing market obviously latches onto trends. That's why when Hunger Games got big, we got Maze Runner and then Divergent and like, everything in
Hmm.
between right after that. And paranormal romance was big because
Oh
Twilight
yeah.
was big at the time. And now it's like once a subgenre exhausts itself, traditional publishing like almost kind of blackballs it a bit and is like, no
Yeah,
more. Let's like give it some time. But we're like, but what if I want more
I
of
know. I
that?
want to read something like
Yeah.
this, and I don't want to read it in 2 to 5 years when you're able to use this as a comp title. I want to read it now.
That is very, very true. You seem like you gravitate towards fantasy, and your first book, Sacrilege, has some fantastical elements and paranormal elements as well.
Hmm.
Is there like subgenres that you would put that in then? Because I don't know if it like really neatly fits into fantasy necessarily.
I don't think it does either. Have advertised it as paranormal romance before, but it also feels not quite that either. I was giving a talk with some other writers, and one of the other speakers said that my book sounded like dark cottagecore. And so I like dove into that for a little while. I made a bunch of marketing material with that. I was like, if you like a dark cottagecore romantic
Yeah.
type of book. So I kind of dove in with that. But that's a book that feels really hard to advertise properly. And I think that's probably why it didn't necessarily, I mean, I didn't try very hard to query, but I think that probably contributed to why it didn't get picked up because it's very, what's the word? Not the most marketable.
I think that's why I do love indie publishing. Like, I don't always need a book to fit neatly into a box. I think it can be so much more than one box. And it feels like already from reading your book, Sacrilege, reading your newest book, which we'll talk about, Heirs of Destruction, you do kind of blend outside of the box. And I always think that makes for amazing stories. So I saw that you did a bit of an interview with Fiona Hansen on her blog. She asked, what is your main advice for young authors? And you said a really beautiful paragraph, but I kind of boiled it down to honor your process. And I really love that advice. I feel like I try to talk about that on my own channel, that writing is not step 1, step 2, step 3. It's really your own creative process. So I'd love to know what your process is and if you feel like it's evolved over the last couple books.
It definitely has evolved. The author that wrote Sacrilege does not exist anymore. She is gone. Her process was, oh my gosh, to compare it to what I do now, Sacrilege was completely pantsed. I had zero plan. Every single chapter, I had no idea what I was going to write. I would just start writing. And I had a very different lifestyle because this was written during quarantine. So I was sitting down to write at 10, 11 p.m. and I would be shutting my laptop and going to bed at 4 or 5 in the morning. And I would literally not plan out anything, not have a goal for the chapter. I would just write. It wasn't quite a free write, but it was similar to that. And it would just pour out of me. And then at 5, 6 in the morning, I'd send it to my critique partner and my beta readers. The next day, they'd be like, wow, that was so good. And I'm like, what happened? Can you tell me? I don't. And then I had to kind of work backwards and outline. I guess technically that's called reverse outlining. And then I had to refine it from there. But most of what was in the rough draft made it into the final book. I think there was 1 or 2 things that got cut. And then I wrote a couple books in between Sacrilege and Heirs, which may or may not ever see the light of day because they're just not the book right now. And then Heirs, I've spent probably 2 years world building at this point, and everything's in an outlined document. Everybody's names are written down, their relationships to each other, what their character motivations are, and I have to outline, not because I have to plan out every part of the chapter, but because I need to kind of have some kind of intention, purpose, all that good stuff. Because it being a series, what happens in one chapter could mean nothing for that book, but it's going to mean something. I did the books very intentionally to the point that what happens in book 1 is very much going to affect something that happens in book 4 and onward. And I can't pants that because I don't know what the later effects are going to be. So I had to meticulously plan this out. And I don't think that if you told me back when I was writing Sacrilege that I was going to work this way, I'd be like, not for me, outlining, bad, I can't do that. But now, I'm rereading Sacrilege to annotate it for a giveaway that I did. And I'm like, I don't know how I did this. I really don't. And I'm so proud of that book. I don't think, if I was forced, I don't think I could rewrite it. That was a different person.
I feel that. I pantsed my first manuscript that I ever finished, and I also feel that way. I'm like, how did I do that? I'm now a very meticulous planner as well. I feel like that's the evolution too. I listen to a lot of other author interviewers, and a lot of people go from pantsing in the beginning to then second, third, fourth books. They're like, okay, I actually did outline this one, and now I can't go back.
Yeah. It's also, there's a lot of, I take a lot of pleasure in world building, and I really love it. That's one of my favorite parts. I get to live in that world fully by doing that. So I don't have to be surprised when my characters do something. They still do surprise me, but for the most part, I kind of have a feel for why they do things.
Yeah, and with world building, so Heirs is so different from Sacrilege. And you're right, the old author, not here anymore. We have Heirs of Destruction author, and it's amazing. By the way, you guys should all read it. I just finished it. So good. But it is more high fantasy in that regard. It's like you say in the comps for your Instagram posts, it's very Game of Thrones-esque. There's a lot of politics happening, a lot. I'd love to like hone in on that part of world building for a moment
Mhm.
because I feel like that has got to be a mind scramble. Like, where do you even begin? Start to think about politics? Like, were you pulling from history and actual things, or were you just making it up as you go?
So with the world building and like, I mean, the way that I kind of looked at it was that the politics are their rules. That's their social contracts, that's their ways that they govern and all these different things. And you have to take a step back and like every single aspect of your life, think, okay, but this doesn't exist in this fantasy world. So how does that change? What is the domino effect there? Like, I did get inspired for the house system. I don't push this comp very heavy because I think it would give people the wrong impression, but I did get the idea for the house system from Gideon the Ninth. The fact that it's all of the houses and all of them are necromancers, but they all serve different aspects towards the emperor. So like that was really inspiring to me. And I just really liked the like grandiose like titles and the emphasis that they place on their roles. And then I'm like, okay, but what does that actually mean? Are they actually doing that? Is how much of it is a title and how much of it is an action? So with the politics, the system is anti-monarchy. So I'm like, okay, there's no king, there's not one being that they all look up to. So there's 8 houses, they all have to balance being equals. 8 is a lot to kind of equalize. That could tip in literally any direction. So my idea was that, okay, in order to keep the balance between 8, they all have to have major control over something, some very important part of society. So it's broken down into 8 that way. And, there is a lot of overlap. That doesn't mean that everybody who comes from that house is really good at that. It's just that the founding families were very good at that particular thing. Like for our our POV characters, the Vesservis family, like they are all in charge of history and scholarship and things like that. Them, descending from vampiric heritage, they have more keen senses, so they know how to listen better than maybe somebody else does. And then it's like, okay, if there's one house that is in charge of the history, what happens when they have a bias? What happens when they're making decisions that they don't want in history? And then you have to take that to every single house and whatever major facet of society that they run. So it's very much like very tension knotted machine because they all have something that the other needs and they can't turn back because then they're going to lose all of those other resources. So just a lot of tension all around. And ideally, the way that that system would work best is if they're all friends and getting along and being honest with each other, but that would not make a very good book. So that's kind of where I started.
Yeah, I like how you explain that. It seems like your process was, okay, here's an aspect that I like, and now let me ask myself 10 questions about that
Mhm.
aspect and like answer them and kind of continue from there. I feel like people ask me that a lot on the channel is like, should I follow this world building packet and ask myself all these questions? Or, what is the go-to approach for world building? Which I know you already said, like, honor your process. It's different for everyone, which I agree. But did you follow some sort of structure, or was it really just this organic, okay, I'm going to look at this, ask myself a question, answer it, and kind of domino from there?
It was the latter. It was very much a series of questions, and some of that in the beginning was trial and error. So the draft that ended up getting finished, rewritten, revised, like going through the whole process was the third attempt at writing this book. I had 2 previous attempts. They were both about 25,000 words, so that is 50,000 words in the garbage. But I would, get writing, get to a point and ask myself those questions. And I've given myself a hard roadblock. And I'm like, okay, well, if this is this way, then this can't be this way. So just really asking myself in every single aspect, like, but that doesn't exist in this world. So how do I make this work? And a lot of that, examining my life and examining what's around me. Like, for example, religion was really easy to ask questions around, not because of the religion itself, but because of what role religion plays. Like, we live technically, there is no major religion. Like, we don't have an assigned religion here, but a lot of our holidays are religious holidays, if or not even religious, they're Christian holidays. A lot of days that we get off of work, a lot of major, seasonal things is around Christian holidays. So I'm like, okay, there is no Christianity in this world, so there's no Christmas. They don't get certain days
Mm.
off, thinking about it in that sense. And then this isn't a capitalistic society, so they don't have a 5-day work week and a 2-day weekend. So there's also the fact that technically these people are never not working. That's got to put some kind of, certain pressure on them. So I'm like, what are all these people's vices? Let me work with that. Like, what happens if you are always working? There's literally all of this responsibility that you're shouldering. And then again, like going back to religion, there is a major religion in this world, and a lot of their holidays do revolve around it, but a lot of the characters are secular. So I'm like, okay, if they don't believe, but they're living in a world that does, what does that do to them? Just questions upon questions, and I can't really keep going without answering them, or I'll have to go back.
Which we never want to do.
No.
Always the worst when you get so far and then you realize, wait, I haven't answered this thing that affects everything I just wrote in the beginning.
George R. R. Martin, actually, I don't know if you read his infamous blog post that got posted and deleted yesterday or today. Yeah, he posted all his complaints about the first episode of season 2 of House of the Dragon, and then he promptly deleted it. And then some people did manage to read it, but the way that he explained it was the fact that they made certain changes in the show, it's not just that change. It's going to have that domino effect. I think he kind of put it into the butterfly effect. So he's like, you change this one thing, you're going to have to justify how we get to, the next point that led to. And I was thinking about it and I was like, yeah, when I eventually get an adaptation, because I do really want that adaptation, I would be like, I'm thinking I would be willing to sacrifice certain things, but we would have to justify it in different ways. And everything that I've done has been so intentional that it's like, can they honor the story that I wrote with the intentions that I had if everything is a domino effect? So it's kind of like, everything is connected. So it's a little bit stressful in that sense, but I think it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, just finishing Heirs of Destruction, I don't want to give too much away, but everything really is connected, even though we're following 3 characters for the most part and their POVs, like everything they all do affects the other also, because all these houses, like you said, are connected. They have to kind of talk to each other and work together. Did you have like some massive crazy murder board? Like, how were you doing this? Like, for like plot points that, the sequence, like how did you keep all of that straight?
I outlined the whole series. That was one thing. I was like, I cannot. Yeah, the whole series. Kind of. It's a little, I'll get to that in a sec, but I was like, I can't publish book 1 if I don't know where this is all leading, because there is already stuff that's happened in book 1 that, as of right now, it's 6 books. That is subject to change. It was 5 a couple months ago. But I'm like, I can't put anything into motion if I don't know where it's going. And like, yeah, I don't need to know the specifics of like when and how, but I need to know what. I need to know what this is all building to. And it's really exciting for me. It's going to be a very long waiting game, but like there's certain things that I've put into book 1 that you guys are not going to find out until book 5, and I know that, and I'm just going to have to wait, I don't know, another 5-6 years for people to figure it out. But I just had to outline the whole thing. I have my world building document, which like technically I guess it's the book Bible. I know that some other authors keep like a book Bible. I don't have every single thing in there, but I do have all the major things that I can refer back to. And I also talk a lot with my writing group. And, if I do happen to forget something, I can just search that character's name and be like, wait, I remember we had a conversation about Ramsey doing this. So let me just search up Ramsey and whatever code word I need. I say Ramsey because I know that my critique partner Kat is probably listening, and Ramsey is her favorite for whatever reason. So I just had to give him a shout out.
Love that. Shouting out the writing group. So you said that you are going to have 6 books, possibly, in the Crown Killer series. How did you go about writing this series? Like, right away you knew it was going to be a series? Or did you start writing and then you were like, okay, I think this needs to be a series?
I think it was never going to fit into one book. I think it was always going to have to be more than one, but I didn't know what. And so I vividly remember these conversations. We thought about a duology, but I'm like, I think there's more here. There are 30 characters with names that are on page at any given time. And then it was going to be a trilogy, but my critique partner was like, I kind of hate trilogies. And I was like, got it. Let's add a fourth book. And then I had outlined all four. I was working on book one and I was like, hey, don't get mad, but I think there's a fifth book in here. So we rewrote that. We redid the outline. And then as I was working, I was like, you know what? I think that if I plant these seeds now, it could turn into this, which means I have to redo the back half of book four's outline and I have to completely redo book five. So great, I did that. And then we added a sixth. And so the way that I'm kind of looking at it right now, which I'm not going to do too much advertising with this because I think it will, again, stick in people's minds the wrong way. But I'm kind of looking at it as two trilogies. Like you look at authors like Robin Hobb, where she has 10,000 books and you have to read them in this order, but it's a trilogy and then a duology and then a couple of books. So I'm looking at it as two trilogies, and there is very much a midpoint, but you can't stop at that midpoint because everything that happens in those first three books is going to, I don't know, I need something more fast and aggressive than a domino effect. It's just gonna, a car crash, a sequence of car crashes. I don't know.
I always love, hearing every author's process because I do think so much of writing, no matter how much we plan, even if we could become plotters when we don't want to, so many things can change at the blink of an eye. So
Yep.
I love that you went from a duology to 6 books. Congratulations.
Yep. Thank you.
And, with a book as big as Heirs, it's about to be 6 books. And like you said, there could be 30 characters on one page at a time. I know I was even taking notes. When there's a lot of characters, I always have a little notebook and I'm like, okay, I'm writing down who this person is so I never forget. I had to do that with Game of Thrones as well. But with that many characters, how is character creation like? Like, is it separate from world building? Is it entwined with that? How do you make sure everyone feels distinct and themselves when you have so many people to write about?
So it really kind of goes backwards. Like I came up with all of the titular heirs. As you know, there are heirs and they have high lords that are side characters in book one. So we have 8 heirs and they all came in my mind first. Well, the POV characters came in my mind first and then, all 8. And for them, their personalities, like, I don't know how to explain it, but like I can see them murkily. I can't picture faces too well, but I can see them pretty murky in my mind. But I can also like assign them, like, for lack of a better word, a vibe. Like Ezra, who's the heir to the first house, he was always very nervous and awkward in my mind. Sage, heir to the second house, came very much like withdrawn, but very caring, but like from a distance, and very effortlessly cool with all the head tattoos. Asriel, my terrible son, he did go through quite a bit of changes, but he was always kind of cocky and charming and all of that. But, I just kind of had a vibe for all of them, and then I have to give them actual personalities and motivations. Like I'll use Galilea as an example, the third sister to the fifth house. She always existed. I always kind of had a vibe for her in my mind, but that doesn't mean that I know how she would react in every situation the way that I do with the POV characters. But she's very important in the sense that she has on-page conversations with the POV characters. So, I kind of worked her personality out through those conversations. And like, yes, I have a general way that she will act, but if Azriel puts her in a certain situation or if she's talking to Rayella about something, it's going to obviously make a bigger change than what I can immediately come up with. So some of it was on the fly, and then I just had to make sure that that was consistent with the vibe that I had created and that it was consistent with other actions that they would take.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you said, Azriel, your chaotic son, seems like he came to your mind pretty quickly as well as the other heirs. But with such big of a world, how did you know who to focus on first with so many interesting characters at play?
So originally, we're going to get into the whole origin story now. So originally this came about because I was rewatching Castlevania, and the dynamic of the main trio in that show, I was like, I need to bottle this and I need to drink it and I need to do something with it. So I finished a rewatch, and like, again, this was like still not quite everything open back up at this point. It was like the middle of the night. I'm like, let me open a Word doc. I feel like writing. And I was also reading Howl's Moving Castle at the same time. So I was like, I want to write something with both of those vibes. And it spawned two different books. So I wrote the first chapter of a very, very old version of Heirs of Destruction and the first chapter to A Dead Whip. And I was like, okay, I wrote the first chapter to both in one night. I'm like, which one do I want to play with? And I went with the one that is now dead, which is fine because that's experience. I can take that with me. And then I went back to, I was calling it Castlevania Whip since it was based off of Castlevania, and it was the main trio. In the show, there's Trevor Belmont, who is this like traveling waylaid monster hunter, and I really liked his gruffness, but his empathy and endless caring for humanity. And I really liked Sypha and her intelligence, and I really loved Alucard and his melodrama. So I'm like, okay, what would it look like if I took on these characters, and what kind of changes would I make? So Virgil is very much Trevor Belmont. Azriel is very much Alucard, and I would say the one that underwent the most changes is Rayella, because there were some things about Sypha that I wanted to keep and some things that I wanted to take. So it did come from rewatching Castlevania in the middle of the night during COVID.
I do love hearing a good origin story because I feel like everyone's inspirations for something is kind of a little chaotic like that. Like you watch something and you're like, okay, wait, let me put this in my notes app. I want to remember this little piece. Let me write something crazy about it. And yeah, maybe work on a dead whip and then come back to it. So I love that.
It was an experience, and I wish that I could say I should have gone with Castlevania from the beginning, that I should have gone with that one, but then I wouldn't have had all the writing experience from working on that other whip.
Yeah, that's very true. And you have a newsletter right now that I was reading, and you said that this book is the book that you've always wanted to write. And so how does that resonate with you now? Is it like, I always wanted to write a big high fantasy, or is it I always wanted to write a book because of these characters? What part of it makes it kind of the book of your heart?
It's very much that I wanted to write something that felt like classic capital F fantasy. Like we always talk about books that have a ball scene, and like there is no not really a ball scene. I wouldn't consider what happens in the book a ball, but like that sort of vibe where, when you think of fantasy, when you look up fantasy aesthetic on Pinterest and you get the pictures of people at balls and you have people riding horses, I really wanted that like classic fantasy feeling, and it obviously expanded a lot. I think it's got a lot of depth to it, and I haven't said anything necessarily with it yet, but I am trying to say something. And I think that once you get through the series, hopefully you will understand what I'm trying to communicate and the statements that I'm trying to make and the things that have mattered to me when I read, and that I want to write them in my own way. Yeah, just very much, I really want it to feel like, yes, this is fantasy.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so interesting too, because we started off the conversation talking about how there are so many subgenres of fantasy. But you're like, no, I want to take it back to like that capital F fantasy. I love that phrasing. Yeah. And like you said, there is so much more depth though to Heirs than just the capital F fantasy and people riding horses and all that, which I still love. Do you feel like you had a theme or these statements that you said you were trying to make from the beginning, or did they come out in your writing process and you realized, oh, actually, this character is saying this for me?
It definitely evolved because having written a couple of previous drafts, the goal was different. And the statements that I'm trying to make now, I don't think that they were necessarily as important in the original version. And then as I'm writing, I'm realizing, oh, this is really important to me. I really do want to get this, hammer this in. So it did kind of evolve. But I mean, one thing that I've always said, or that I've always held to, and like it's a little hard to put it into a succinct statement, but I just kind of want to emphasize that, whatever happens in this series, like it's just what happens in the series. The actions that happened before the book, and I don't know that I'll ever be the type of author that goes back and writes like a bunch of backstory and history, but like all the stuff that happened before that affected what's happening now, but it's not what's happening now. All of the decisions that they're making right now could not matter in like a couple of centuries after, their great grandkids are the ones in charge. Everything that they're building towards could very easily get taken down. So now I remember what it was. Halsey has a song called Bells in Santa Fe, and what she keeps repeating is all of this is temporary. And so I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, yes, I really want it to feel like a snapshot of the particular moment that I'm writing about in that world, because it's going to keep going. I mean, spoiler alert, the series is not going to end with an apocalypse where everybody in the world as they know it collapses, but it's going to keep moving, and other people are going to come into power and they might want to do it differently. And it may not matter what these characters' decisions were. People may not care. They may look at them differently later on, but this is what's happening right now for them. So I'm really holding to that. And that's a Tolkien-ish belief that I always like to go off of, because the thing about Tolkien is that his work, you're seeing one part of it, but it's a much larger world. And you know that the whole time, that you're just seeing one piece of it. And I really would like to do that, that this is not the entire world.
That's really interesting too, because now having read it, and so I'm listening to you talk about it and kind of like putting it back on my reading experience. And it is interesting because you have written it in such a way, though, where I was so immersed in our three POV characters that I'm just like, but this is their world. Like,
Yeah.
this is it. So I like that you are throwing it back to a Halsey song as well, because I love Halsey, that all of this is temporary because the characters, obviously, when they're in the moment, they're putting so much weight on every decision because it affects every aspect of their life. But like you said, that won't matter in centuries from now when you are talking about political system that has been before them and will come after them. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
One of my writing friends had made a joke, and I'm not going to remember the exact wording, but you vaguely hear about the neighboring nation being Steephelm, and it's not important in book one, but you know that it's there. And one of my writer friends made a joke that, like, it would be so funny if everyone that lives over in Steephelm was just like, what are they doing over there? Like, it's life and death in this nation of Adjustan, and everybody else is just chilling in Steephelm. Like, what are they doing? That literally nothing could possibly be that deep, but for the characters, it is that deep. So,
Right, like Adristan and all the houses and all the characters. I love fantasy book naming conventions. I think it's very fun and interesting. So I'd love to know how you came up with the names for all your houses and just literally every name. How did you do it?
it really depends on which aspect of it. Like for the three main characters, Asriel sounds cool. That's literally it.
Love it.
Virgil, I wanted a name that sounded very like solid. I'm like strong male names. Like I need something that just sounds important. And Virgil obviously is like a character in the whole, I don't even know what word to use. That, we have Dante's Inferno and there is a Virgil in there. So it does kind of give you a little bit of like, oh, this is someone of importance. Rayella was the only one where I was Googling like fantasy names and her name came up. And then I found out after I started writing with her name that there was also a character in A Song of Ice and Fire named Rayella. So I was like, oh no, people are going to think this is Game of Thrones fan fiction, but it's not. I literally was just looking up fantasy sounding pretty names, and hers was one that came up, and I stuck with it. All three of them, they were the only three that had original names in the first chapter that I wrote that night after watching Castlevania. Virgil, actually no, Virgil was always Virgil. Asriel was another long A name. I want to say it was like, if it was Amadeus, that's funny because now there's a different character named Amadeus. And Rayella was Guinevere. And that was because I really think that that's a very classic fantasy sounding name. I do think she could still fit as a Guinevere, but for, the version that we have now, it's Rayella. And then the houses, for most of them, it came up through conversation with friends, like what sounds like a good name for an important house. But the two POV characters, I did name them just thinking really hard. Midar just came out thinking, I was like, okay, it has to start with an M. I just got the vibe it had to start with an M. And then that eventually came out. And then Veservis, I wanted something that sounded like Vesuvius. And I'm like, okay, how do I move around these letters? All the other houses came through conversation. The religion, Lucerianism, came through somewhere there's a root that means light, and there's a lot to do with candles. So there's that. Dux Doctrina. My husband makes fun of me for this because both of those words, Dux and Doctrina, mean leader, Latin. So their names are literally like leader.
Love it.
Yeah, it is what it is. And then all of their first names was either I thought it sounded cool, or I just looked up real quick like fantasy names for men, that sort of thing. So it was a mix. The only ones that I really had to like hunker down on were the houses, because that did not come naturally at all.
See, what I'm gathering is that actually you're really good at naming things. I feel like I'm horrible at naming things, which is why I'm always like, tell me how you got these names.
I like threw a tantrum sometimes because I would like, I'll be writing and then I'll be like, okay, we need another tertiary character. He's going to be in one scene and I have to give him a name, and I'll get really angry and toss it in my writers group. Like, can someone please name this character we will never see again? Like there's so many people that I will like spend so long and then they're in like maybe a handful of chapters.
I hate naming people. In my story right now, my viewers know that I have like named this guy Achilles after a
Mm.
song. It's not going to be his name. It's like a contemporary world. Like you can't name a guy Achilles in 2024. That's strange. I have not been able to figure out a name. So he's just been Achilles this whole time, and then I'll have to like control F it and change it at some point when I find out his name for real. There was like 2 points, and I think it literally is like in the first chapter, and I was like writing notes on my Kindle as I do, and I just remember going, "What?" And then, oh my gosh, because you mentioned vampire lineage, and then
Hmm.
Rayella has a dragon like off in the distance, and I was like, oh my gosh, wait, we're getting vampires and dragons in this? I was freaking out. I was so excited. So I felt like they were like so casually thrown into the first chapter, which I kind of love because they are like minor points in this very massive, amazing world that you've built. So how was like combining all of these fantastical elements that you have, and how did you decide what you wanted to throw in there?
So that came about through the houses and deciding what were the 8 major, for lack of a better word, exports. Like, what is the thing for each house? And then what would be a useful power for them? How did they get to that point? Because the way that the 8 houses came about was during the monarchy, there were, they were able to form these houses and they were obviously less powerful during a monarchy, but for them to rise to that level of station, because technically I'm only using lords, but if we're going through like a whole hierarchy, they'd be like, I think the very highest one under king is duke. So they'd be like at that level. They're at the highest level for our understanding. For them to rise to that station, they have to have a considerable amount of power. And as I explained
Mm-hmm.
with House Veservis, them having vampiric heritage gives them more advanced senses. They're quicker, they can see better, they can hear better, so that makes them good scholars. They can listen from a distance, that makes them good spies. They're more perceptive to things happening around them, so they're not having that tunnel vision. So I just had to do that for every single house. So I decided the first house are builders, construction workers, carpenters, all that sort of thing. Any sort of building that's not necessarily artistic, although I do think it is very much an art, but it's not necessary. It's more functional. So they are giants, and I think it's said at some point by someone that Ezra is the tallest man that they've ever seen. In our understanding, he'd be like a really tall basketball player. Like he's only like 7 feet, which is still incredibly tall, but
Yeah.
like that's not a giant. That's not a literal giant. And then a lot of the houses are Fae. The 4th house, House Redspire, and the 5th house, Stillgroves. They're both Fae. And Redspires are inclined towards the arts, and that's just their Fae sensitivities are more towards artistic things, being able to pull beauty out of everything. The Stillgroves are more towards nurturing, so like very much plants, very much like Green Witch vibes, and food as well. House Oberon are an Aviatus were interesting in the way that I am calling them elven descendants, but I wanted them to be almost alien because their powers very much have to do with more almost spiritual. The Oberons are healers, so anything to do with like, by our understanding, doctors, midwives, healers, just all of those things, their powers are very much towards healing and just the human condition in general. Whereas Aviatus they're very, the religion, they're very spiritual. They have that sort of sensitivity to there being things beyond human. The Light Pikes are technically men, but they're men in the way that Aragorn in Lord of the Rings is a man. Like, man, but got some extra stuff going on. And the Light Pikes all have a higher sensitivity towards numbers. The way that we communicate with words, they're much more comfortable doing math and working with numbers. So they are accountants and anything that has to do with money and high amounts of numbers. And then the Midars are strong men, so they are typically the justice because, they can protect a little bit easier. And the founding families from centuries ago, they were all the best. They were all the cream of the crop of their types of people. And then you get to where we are now a couple centuries later, and they've all been intermarrying, and there's also humans in this world, like there definitely are humans, so they've all been intermarrying, so they're not vampires in the Dracula and the Alucard sense. They're their ancestors were vampires and they've intermarried, and it's like watered down. Everybody's a watered down version of whatever I just listed. And I really wanted it to be like a melting pot almost in that sense. They've all come from these great and powerful things, and then they're kind of just a little bit more ordinary. Like you meet people like Ezra, and it's like, this is a giant with magic that can do building things. Like he's just this timid 7-foot guy. And it's like, just kind of, for lack of a better word, humbling the experience of seeing these types of people. Because again, them being vampires is one thing, but what are they really doing? That technically by this point, by all of the intermarrying and stuff, that somebody else couldn't do. They've inherited the greatness of their ancestors, but they themselves are not necessarily great.
Yeah, I found that really interesting with Rayella because it's talked about in her storyline of how she has some more of those keen senses compared to others in her line. And I do like that you kind of made it like that watered down version, like you said, kind of showing that we can't always take the greatness of maybe people before us. We only get a little bit of them. So that is like another way that like history really kind of plays a role in your story, which is really cool. And also with intermarrying. So I know politics is the main plot of the book, but there are some romantic subplots. So what can you say about the relationships in this book? Like how was writing those kind of B plots?
Start with the easiest and least spoilery answer. It's been really fun as I keep working on the series to decide what everybody who's not a main character is going to do, because a lot of them do have romances that you will see and possibly hinting at romances that happened in the past that have not been brought up already. But with the side characters, it's really fun because that's just mess that's happening in the background. Like, that's not as world ending. I will start with Azriel. In the book, and this is not a spoiler, he has 3 romantic ties. He has a little flirtatious thing going on with Galilea. Flirtatious being a very soft way to put it. I just always found them to have great chemistry whenever I had to put them in a scene together. So I'm like, let's have a little fun with this. I think that's always really fun when you can find characters that have chemistry. So I think that's just a really nice coincidence that happened. And I can't say what will pan out from that, but things certainly will pan out. He's got more than a little friendship going on with his guard, Barrett.
Yes.
Yes. And and again, I cannot say where that will pan out, but some things will pan out. And I think that just goes to show, when you have such a strong bond with someone, I do think it's very romantic in a capital R sense that Barrett has essentially devoted his life to keeping Azriel safe, and Azriel has devoted his life to making terrible decisions at every opportunity. So he always needs to be kept safe. But they very much need each other. And I think that lines getting blurred is an interesting thing to play with. And then once you start adding politics, that's going to get very messy. And then you have his political betrothal, Freya. And I am going to have so much fun with that. I think that one thing that was really fun to decide was, in this world, do they marry for love or do they marry for political reasons? And the answer is yes. They marry for both. And the customs are different in each house. And I'm debating if I want to put this in the appendix in book 2, but there are certain customs for each house when they marry, or why and how they marry, because some houses have nothing. They're like, will it be politically beneficial? Cool. Do you want to marry someone for love? Cool. And then some of them are like, it has to be politically beneficial. And some of them are, it has to be politically beneficial, but you can kind of find someone that you mesh with, that sort of thing. And so at the beginning of the book, we're told that High Lord Veservis and High Lord Lencor have been talking about a betrothal since they had kids. And so that's going to be something interesting to watch play out, because nothing really comes of it in book 1. There's not time. But I think moving forward, it will be very interesting to explore what happens when you are mixing politics in with romantic feelings, because I think you can very much tell from their first couple of interactions that they do have the potential for something. But when you are hanging the fact that both of their fathers orchestrated this, what is that going to do? And that could be a good thing. That could be a bad thing. So I think that will be very interesting for people to watch play out. And I also just think no matter who Azriel is with, he's always got somebody who needs to keep him in check, keep him on a little bit of his leash. So I think he's found 3 people who do that very well. So that's going to be fun. And then my other two POV characters. It's not a question of if. I mean, not we all, but if you read the book, you know how that pans out. And that was my intention from the beginning. But I think that I tend to write, when I go into writing romance, for the most part with main characters at least, I tend to know how I want it to play out. So it's not a matter of will they, won't they? It's more a matter of putting obstacles in between them and then seeing what happens. And I think that that's a little bit more fun. There will be obstacles, and I will not say what happens on the other side of those obstacles. And it could be super fun or it could be super not fun. But
I love it. I love it. The romance subplots were really great in this book. I still am like shocked at how you have kept all of these, honestly, like plot points just in check and on pace, because the book paces super, super well.
thank you.
Yeah, and along with, you have the romantic relationships, but I really loved seeing also these familial relationships with these heirs and their parents and, siblings. And so there's a lot of complicated familial ties that we get to see. How was writing those relationships?
Didn't expect it to be so to the level that it was. What ended up happening as I kept working on book one, and then now that I'm kind of tweaking the outlines for the later books, everything, I mean, they are the main POV characters. Everything is going to come back to Azriel and Raella. Like, so much of how things pan out is their siblinghood and the decisions that they make and the ways that they move around each other. And I think that I didn't go into writing this expecting for there to be this much depth between them. Because in the original draft, in that first chapter that I wrote, they were cousins or like step cousins or like half cousins, something like that. But them being half siblings, but refusing to use the term half siblings is so much deeper in a sense. And I think that just everything that they do always ends up coming back to each other. And I don't like consciously write it that way, but I'll toss an idea out to my writers group about Raella, and they're like, oh my God. And then Azriel, this, and this. And I'm like, oh my God, you're right. Everything is really just, it's about them. And that became really the core of it while we were beta phases and rewriting and making edits. Just everybody latched onto their siblinghood and some of those moments. Like, I didn't mean for certain moments between them to stick out so much, and then they did with readers, with my early readers especially. And I was like, okay, let me consciously think about that now. So I think that it's really funny because now that the book is already out, like, I mean, we have Brat by Charlie XCX, and I think her song Apple that is such a crazy accurate song. Like, the apple's rotten to the core from all the things passed down from all the apples coming before. And I will not say this as a spoiler because you figure this out in the first moment that you meet him. Alden Veservis, I will see you in hell. He is the epitome. He and Raella especially are the epitome of my father is the worst man alive and I am his favorite daughter. It's just what I really wanted to do with him especially was like, what happens when you have someone who has to be in a position of authority and they have children and they love those children, but they also have to make decisions that keep their nation running, and then kind of, juxtaposing that against Virgil and his father, because I think that you can tell from their first interaction that there is a deep respect there, but they cannot always show love in the way that, we need to be shown love. None of these parents are very going to pull you in for a hug for no reason. Like Alden does that in one of the early chapters, and Raella's like, that's weird. I think it's just really interesting to play with what happens when you put characters in situations where they cannot show affection and they have to make decisions that are for the better of thousands to millions of people rather than what's best for their children individually.
Yeah. No, the familial relationships are very interesting, especially I do think, like you said, like the parents and the heirs, because there is quite a distance between them, but they're making these decisions that affect their kids in such big ways, but they keep them at arm's length. And that was really interesting to read about.
I think it would have been really interesting if I had the space and the mental bandwidth to write more POVs, because I know this in the back of my mind, but for example, a character like Sage, who is very empathetic to humanity, their High Lord is their cousin. So there's a little bit more of a closer relationship there. They don't have that parental resentment thing going on. And I think that you can just tell from Sage's actions that they're an empathetic person that's going to do things for people that they care about. And I think that that can speak to the relationship that they had with their cousin. But then, you get someone like Asriel who just needs to make daddy proud.
Yeah. Well, with so many of these characters, I have to ask, who are your favorite?
Rayella, of course. She's definitely my favorite. I get into her head the easiest, so that's a lot of the reason, but also just I think that there is just so much that I'm so excited to put on page with her. Galilea was also another favorite. I think her getting her moments to shine, flirting with Asriel, them finding out certain things about the nature of what she does for her house was really interesting. Other favorites, I'm trying to name someone who's not the big one. Honestly, he's not my favorite because he's the worst person in the entire universe, but I do think writing Alden is very fun. And then here's the unfortunate thing. So I've been watching Interview with the Vampire,
Mm,
and I haven't read the books because I tried reading Interview with the Vampire and it just was not clicking, but it was the audiobook, so I'm going to give the physical a try because I am very interested in the Vampire Chronicles. But I kind of went through the wiki and looked through all the plots of the books, and then I found Anne Rice very fascinating. And one thing about her is she loves Lestat. And the way that she explains him is she's like, I can look at anything and I know how Lestat would feel about that. And she kept writing these books. She didn't intend for the series to be what, 8, 9 books. She's like, Lestat has more in him. And unfortunately for me, Asriel is turning into my Lestat because it's just, oh my God, my terrible son. And here's the thing, and this is not a spoiler because no one knows anything yet, but I really do think that he is building something that is going to be very interesting to read about. And although I do find it easiest to get in Rayella's head, I do feel like a lot of book one revolves around decisions that are made involving her, and she pushes a lot of the plot. I do still feel like, although all 3 of them are the main characters of the series, I do feel like Asriel has a very large role to play, and I think it's going to be really interesting to explore that. So it's not that he is my favorite, it's against my will. I love him and want to keep writing about him.
he just has more in him.
Ugh, unfortunately, yes.
And I have to ask, since I asked what are your favorite characters, I have to know what house you think you'd be in.
I did a whole Zodiac thing that I posted on social media, and by that, technically I would be in House Redspire, and I do love House Redspire. I would want to be in House Redspire, but I don't know if me personally as a person I would be in there. I would want to be in House Redspire, but logistically could end up in a different house. You know what? There's a very slim chance I could squeeze my way into House Veservis, but it's probably House Redspire. Let's call it there.
I did have a question about religion because I know Sacrilege had so many religious undertones and exploration of religion, and Heirs does that in such a different way. So how did you form the religion? You have this big religion where, like you said, a lot of your characters are secular, so they aren't following this religion. So how did you create that?
So then even becoming a house was an interesting choice because for everything else, it's for the most part, something that you can box and ship out. It's some kind of physical, tangible thing that is going to contribute. But, not everyone is religious, and most of the characters in the book are not. So it's why is one major house about this one religion? Well, technically it's for all, but we can tell that they're leaning towards one. And I just think that, I think that it was very interesting to make that statement on page that faith as a concept is necessary enough to warrant existing in that much of a capacity, that even though so many of the characters have fallen away, that faith as an idea, as something that you feel, is still very present. And I think that that was just important for me to include. The way that it kind of trickles down into the individual characters, it depends. It really does depend. I wrote part of it thinking that a couple more of them were going to be a little bit more religious, but then some of them are not. So, I mean, it could also depend on the circumstances. We will see the presence and the feelings of faith ebbing and flowing because that is how the world works as well. And I just had to think okay, in our world, because it's such a big religion, it affects this, and this. So I got to go tie that into this now. So yeah, it really is. It's very present. And I think that that's interesting to see how all of the other characters play off of it. I think there is a moment where Raven, the heir to that house, says something to the effect of that faith is necessary. And I mean, if you read Sacrilege, I have strong feelings about that, but
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting to look at the world that way, find it that necessary.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I also like exploring religion in a ton of different aspects, with religious trauma and all, and find books that explore religion. And I don't know, both of your books explore religion in like two very different ways. And it's very interesting to kind of like dive into it from that perspective. So I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I really did mean it when I put it on the trope map as we have Catholicism at home.
Yes, yes.
I
I
really
saw
did mean
that.
that. If you want a fantasy version of Catholicism,
Yeah, I know it felt very much like the characters who were secular were like the characters who like grew up Catholic and now never go to church? That's how it felt. It was just kind of like, yeah, like I know everything about it. I don't believe in it now. It's just kind of like I go through the motions, like how you said, like we have a lot of
yeah.
holidays that are like Christian-based holidays. So yeah, yeah. So I relate to that. But with your Instagram, we just talked
hmm
about how you made your trope map and you made this great reel and TikTok about, all the houses being for zodiac signs. How has been the experience of marketing your book on social media? I feel like you're doing a great job. Everything you post is gorgeous.
I hate marketing so much. If you are listening to this, is it not enough that I wrote the book and that it's for sale? I want to go into hiding like Suzanne Collins. My God, I hate marketing so much. I hate it. And I haven't posted on Instagram in a couple days. I've kept posting on TikTok because it will eat me if I don't. But like Instagram, I haven't posted in a few days because I'm running dry on ideas. And TikTok is a slot machine. I can keep putting the same thing in and get a little bit more output. But Instagram, do not think I can get away with that. I really hate it. I do love being on social media. I love Twitter so much. I know that it gets a bad rep, especially now. And like, I don't get me wrong, I don't love the changes that have been made. I do not love who
Mhm.
owns Twitter now, but I do love that I can just like tweet something goofy. Like, I can quote tweet like a meme of someone being terrible and be like, this is so Asriel. And then that gets people interested. Like, that's super nice. But, it has to be a little bit more curated. And like, I've gotten better over time, but like, even after Sacrilege published, I didn't have all these social media accounts. Like I was mainly going hard on Twitter, word of mouth, and then I was like months, maybe even pushing past a year after Sacrilege got published is when I really started digging into book talk and
Mm.
Instagram and things like that. And I had to learn, first of all, how to make these graphics. And then, when is the best time for me to post them? How feasible is it for me to get a week's worth put together? So it's been really hard. I'm still not quite managing, but I do enjoy being on social media. So just like using it, seeing what other people do is at least helpful in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I found you on Twitter first. That's how I found you and read Sacrilege. So, how has it been with all the changes? And I refuse to call it X. Sorry. I just
Yeah.
like will not. It will always be Twitter. So, with those like big changes, like how has that affected, like you said, like your marketing experience, or do you feel like it's affected it at all?
Immediately after it became something else, it did feel like I got kind of hit. I felt like I got less reach. I felt like people who didn't already follow me wouldn't really see it as often. I felt like when I was working on Sacrilege, I could tweet something kind of goofy and it would get a fair amount of likes and I would get a little bit of interest. And that still happens. It's not that that doesn't happen, but immediately after it felt like it took a hit. It can be like a slot machine some days. Like I posted an older version of the trope map and it for some reason went very viral. Like it got several tens of thousands of likes. And with those tens of thousands of likes came a bunch of people who told me all of the reasons they would not read it. It was really weird because I've had tweets go viral before, but they were goofy. Like I think the first time I went really viral was a Bridgerton tweet. Like, and I don't even like Bridgerton that much. It was like a thirst tweet over Anthony. And then so I post this trope map thinking, my usual 20 habitual likers are going to like it. And then there's a couple 10,000. But the way that I worded the caption is what I think got people is that I posted the trope map. And mind you, the book was written, edited, and getting ready to be published by this point. We were well past making large scale changes. So I just posted the trope map. I was like, what do you think? Would y'all read this? And I meant it in like a goofy, silly, whatever way. Like, trope map, would y'all read this? And then I got people like, I don't think so. I think that you're putting too many mythological characters. This sounds really basic. The market's oversaturated for this right now. And I'm like, I am not genuinely, I had to put out a statement and be like, I am not genuinely asking. This book is about to go on sale. And I got people responding like, oh, I thought like you were asking for opinions if like you should write this. And I was like, I think that
No.
if you took one look at my profile, you would know that that wasn't the case. So that was crazy. But with all of the non-support, me following up like, guys, I'm not legitimately asking, like the book is almost out, that did get me the good kind of attention as well. People being like, don't listen to the haters, whatever. I think just never pose it like a question. That was a lesson learned. But that was like a very random moment because like once Twitter added like the views feature where you can see that way more people see your tweet than actually interact with it, it was like a very like at first it didn't really make a difference because I'm like, I don't need to know that 700 people saw it and only 3 people liked it. That's humiliating. But then it was like several 100,000 people saw it and tens of thousands of people interacted with it. So that was really interesting. And I would like, okay, here's the thing. I would like if that happened again. I would like if it happened in a sense that people did not directly tell me to my face why they wouldn't want to read it. But all press is good press. I did get a lot more good attention off of that. So
Yeah, and that is so fascinating because I actually just filmed a video today where I was ranking tropes and talking about the tropification of books on social
mhm.
media. And I
I
feel
have a
like,
lot of feelings about that.
yeah, I feel like what you just talked about brings up a really good point of like the trope map is a way to market the book, to entice people to get interested. But when people see a list of tropes, like, I don't know, it how do I want to say this? It wants to like, or people want to condense the book into
Hmm.
just those tropes without realizing like there is so much more. So like those comments of like, no, there's too many mythological things and all this stuff, but they have no idea because like I said, like I was thrown, like I was like, oh my gosh, there's vampires, amazing, but it's not vampires in the sense that you think it is. It's vampires in your very own unique way that has a functional role in this world that has way more
Yeah.
depth and meaning. And so I think it's interesting when people market with tropes because it can do so well since that's what people are doing now. But then people just base a book on a trope. And if it has like one thing, one trope they don't like, they're like, throw it all out. Actually, I don't want any of it. I'm like, what?
And then, like, most of what was on there wasn't even a trope because I can't really put Heirs into too many tropes. Like, I can think of like maybe 2 or 3 off the top of my head, but I went to just like describe aspects of the book, like little descriptors of stuff that might show up. Political fantasy, that is a genre, that's not a trope. And like the existence of the mythological beings, that's an aspect of the book. It's not really a trope. I wouldn't call that a trope. Yeah, so now I just mark it like pathetic blonde man because that's a thing right now. Catholicism at home, that sort of thing. So learn my lesson.
Yeah, and with marketing is such a hard part of self-publishing, are there other hard parts that you find about the self-publishing process? Or are there any also like joys that you have found throughout this journey?
Always going to be glad that I self-published. I will start there. I would not do it differently. With Sacrilege, I sent all of maybe 2 or 3 query letters, and I hated it so much. And I know that people have their, what's the word? Like success stories, and it's like I went from 100 rejections to just the one. Yeah, I don't want 100 rejections. I don't want to do that. I could just there, it's available. And, I'm always going to be glad that I did it. And I do find a lot of joy in it. And I find a lot of joy identifying as being an indie author, being a small author, and being in community with other small authors. But there is a lot of the opposite of that. This is going to be really hard to admit, but I almost pulled Heirs from shelves after it went up. Like Sacrilege, I was always immediately proud of it, and it did as well as I could expect because I had nothing to compare it to. And then Sacrilege has done so well to the point that it feels very different starting from scratch with another book. And it's very different and it's a lot more to ask of readers. Sacrilege was a standalone. You have nothing to lose really by reading it. Whereas with Heirs, I'm asking you to invest in a couple of years with me. And I was not necessarily I've realized since then I was overreacting, but I was not necessarily seeing the output that I had wanted, and that compared to how Sacrilege did at the time it was published, I thought it was not doing well. And I've since realized that I was overreacting and that it was doing about as well as Sacrilege. And I don't need it to do better than Sacrilege because, managing my expectations. Having it be a numbers game on like my dashboard, like with KDP, I can only see individual months. I can't see how well it did in its first day necessarily. I can't really see how well it did, like I can probably get it to give me that data, but it's a lot of pulling from different things and it might not be super accurate. So I can only look back at the bigger picture. And obviously me being a first time author who had, a lot of marketing going on when Sacrilege came out, it did pretty well in its initial months. And I also released it at the first of the month. So there was time for there to be a bigger number. And then with Heirs, I released it in the last week of the month. And it's, again, all of these different things. And I realize I'm talking a lot about numbers, and it's not about numbers. It's not that I want to sell a certain amount of copies. It's not that I want to make a certain amount of money. It's really just what is important to me is that I get to share story. And if it's like if I'm not being given a chance to do that, it does hurt because it feels so personal. And like I could not make money off of it because, in a lot of senses, I haven't. I've done a lot of free sales. I will do free sales with Heirs of Destruction because it's not that I want to make a certain amount. It's that I want people to read it. I want them to read my story. I want them to give me a chance as a creative, as someone trying to make statements. And I feel it's very much an exchange. I want to share. And if I'm not being given that chance, it does feel a little bit personal. And I know that it's not. I know that nobody's looking at me and thinking like, I specifically do not want to read your book because I don't care or whatever. I know that a lot of factors go into it, but like that has been very hard to like kind of get over myself in that sense. So indie publishing is scary in that sense, but I could also be traditionally published and my publisher could never advertise my book for me and I would have to do it all myself anyway and I could still get this amount of output. So I don't think that, me being traditionally published would necessarily be better in any sort of way. So
thank you for talking about that because it is a vulnerable topic. You are putting yourself out there when you're putting your work. And when you said like you really are in this for the readers, but it still does come down to numbers and it must be stressful because you do have Sacrilege now, like you said. I guess something to, for lack of a better word, like compare it to. But hopefully it continues like Sacrilege did, where it like just ramps up over time and finds its readers. Because marketing takes time. And like a book finding its readers, especially when you can't fit it in a box and it doesn't have like, here are 3 tropes that everyone loves. And this is what it is. Like Heirs is so much more than that. And I know it's going to find its readers because it is chef's kiss. So great.
Thank you.
Highly recommend. With that, do you want to give like a little pitch for Heirs? Tell the viewers why they should read this book?
So I think that it's appealing to anyone who's looking for a long series, first of all, because I have actually seen a lot of posts like, give me a long fantasy series, bring back long fantasy series. And I do feel that traditional publishing is kind of pushing duologies and things like that right now. Lots of angst. You will always get a lot of angst from me. Very plot heavy, but also very rich with character. Very capital R romantic. So not a romance, but very romantic. And one thing that you are always going to get from me, and I can promise this, it's not going to be happy the whole time, but I love happy endings. It is pushing towards a happy ending. And if you want something that's going to make you feel the way that Game of Thrones did, the way that Dune did, but lacking certain grimdark elements, because I'm not writing a grimdark story. So if you want something that's looking at fantasy from a different aspect, if you're looking for characters who kind of suck at what they have to do, but they have to do it anyway, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. If you're looking for very complex political scheming and on all ends, if you're looking for a web that's just, got 10,000 ties, I do think that it would be really good and really interesting for you. And if you like if you're looking at characters who have almost this very real feeling, religious trauma and love that they want to give, but they're in a fantasy setting, what would that look like if it's someone just like you that is in a fantasy setting and they have powers and they have to rule over a lot of land and people and resources? I do think that would be very interesting for you. So I will pitch Heirs that way, that it's for a very niche group of people who love fantasy and maybe want to explore underbelly of certain things.
Like I said, I just finished it. Has Mik approval. It's super amazing. And also read Sacrilege if you haven't already, because it's also beautifully written.
Thank you.
do you want to let the viewers know where to find you on your social media so they can go give all of your great marketing attention?
So most of my socials are Vitus Vital, and most of them have an underscore at the end. Not all of them, but Instagram, TikTok, Tumblr, all of those are Vitus Vital. Twitter is Even Stars with 3 S's at the end because I love Lord of the Rings. And I think that's most of my social media. All of my social medias are interconnected. There's a link tree on everything. So if you find one, you will find all. So Vitus Vital underscore.
Well, thank you again for coming today.
When you had sent me the questions, I was so excited because this is very much like I love talking about things at this depth. This is like when I'm in the shower and I'm like fantasizing about being on like a TV show and getting to talk for this long. This is just like, so you are such a good interview. You asked such good questions. I was so excited. So you let me talk for a really long time. So I feel like I got the big stuff that is not super spoilery out of the way.
I know that was honestly really hard to do. It's like the balance. I was like, I want to ask a lot, but I want people to go read the book and not spoil it for everyone. So that was really difficult, but thank you. Yeah, I could talk about writing for the rest of my life all the time. I could just yap.
Same.
So thank you for yapping with me.
And that's a wrap on episode 3 of Pen to Pod. Thank you so much for listening. I had an amazing time talking with Tien Vitus about her projects here on Pen to Pod, and I hope that you all go read Heirs of Destruction as soon as you can. If you're newer to the podcast, we have bi-weekly episodes of author interviews, and then in the off weeks, I come on for a solo episode where I dive a little bit deeper on different writing craft topics. This month, for October, we are talking about voice. So last week, I talked about writer voice, and next week, we will be taking that one step further and looking at more examples of writer voice using short stories about vampires from the short story collection called Vampires Never Get Old. So if you haven't yet already, highly suggest also reading that. It is available right now on Kindle Unlimited if you do have access to that. If you don't already, give this podcast a follow if you are listening on Apple and Spotify. Doing so helps other listeners like yourself find us, but it also allows you to get notified every time a new episode drops. I'm Mikayla, but you can call me Mik from Mik Writes on YouTube. If you don't already subscribe to my YouTube channel, go ahead and check it out. I talk a lot about writing craft as well as my own writing journey on YouTube. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful week of writing. See you next time.